With this one simple, beginner-friendly project, you will learn 80% of the React concepts that you will use on a daily basis. Step by step, we will build out this application and learn all of the important topics you need to begin your journey learning React. With this to-do list app, we will cover hooks, states, conditional rendering, working with data, JSX, and responding to events. So, let's get into it. To get started with our project, the first thing we need to do is initialize our application. So what we're going to need to do is open up our terminal, which you can either navigate to up here or by using the shortcut. Once you've opened the terminal, you need to use the command npm create vite at latest. And this is going to create a Vite project using the latest version. Once we've pressed enter, we're then going to put a full stop. This is going to create the project in the current folder that we've opened up VS Code. After that, we can use the default package name, and then we need to select which type of project we're trying to build. So if we navigate up, we can use React here. For this project, we're going to be using JavaScript. And after that, we've created the scaffolding for our project, and we can now run npm install. And once that's done, we can start the application by running npm run dev. Once we've done that, we can see a URL which has appeared in the terminal. If we copy that and paste it into our browser, we'll then be able to see our application. Now, first things first, we need to explain the file structure of our application. We have a Vite config file, which we don't need to worry about for now. We have a README. We have a package.json. Now, this file actually contains all of our dependencies and scripts for how we're going to run our application. Package.lock.json, we don't need to worry about this one. The index.html file. Now, this is the base of our application. Here we can see that we have the head, and within the body, we have the root component. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. We can ignore the git file and also the ESLint. Now within the source folder, we have some files which have been generated. For the main file, we're actually not going to change anything here. We're just going to remove the import of the CSS file. Now, like I just said, the index.css, we can remove this file as we're not going to need it. Now the app.jsx file is the root of our application. This is where it all starts. And you can see that within the main.jsx file. Here we've imported some things for React and also our app, which is our root component. Now to declare this root component, we need to have this code here. So this is basically saying create a root within the React DOM by getting the element by root. And then we're going to render our application. And we're rendering this application within a react.strict-mode environment. We don't really need to know what this react.strict-mode means for this project, so we're going to ignore that for now. This main.jsx file is now going to stay like this for the rest of the project. So app file, we're going to need this as this is containing our application. The app.css file, we're still going to need. And the assets, we're not going to. Once we remove these assets and also the assets within the public folder, you're going to see that we get an error on the application. So we've now cleaned up our folder structure and we've removed anything that we don't really need. Let's first remove all of the default code which was generated by Vite. And then we can remove this state variable and the imports which are now not going to work because we removed them from the folder. So now that we've done that, you can see all of the errors have went away, but we're not actually rendering anything within our application. This is because we have nothing within this return part of our function. This here is the structure of any component that you'll have within your application. We have our imports at the top, which are things that are required for the folder. And then we also have our function here, which in our case is the app. Within the function, you can then declare your state variables and then have a return. For us, we're returning an empty fragment. Then within the same file, you need to decide what you're exporting. When you export something from a component, that just means that you can access it within other files. So we're exporting our app because we're going to need it within our main file. So let's put something within this return so we can actually see something on the page. If we just put hi, as you can see, we can now see hi on the page. Now that you know how your React application is working, we can actually get started working on the real application. Let's first remove this hi element, and we can replace it with the first part of our code, which is going to be the header. Our header is going to be structured like this. We have a couple divs, a p element, another div, and some more text. As you can see on the right, this doesn't have any styling. Now the styling for this project, I'm actually not going to get into detail about, so I'm going to use some CSS that I've prepared earlier when I built this project before. Our app file is using the app.css, so this is where I'm going to paste that CSS that was prepared. I'm going to open that file and I'm going to delete everything that's already here, because this is what was being used within the default Vite application. And here's the CSS that we're going to be using for the project. Now that we've added our styling, you can see this is looking much better and is actually the final styling that we're going to use for the project. So for our add task button, we actually want to use something called React icons. So we're going to delete this plus and we're going to import into our project these React icons. To do that, we first need to close our terminal. You can do this using Control-C if you're on a Mac, or the respective command on Windows. And then we're going to run npm install react icons. Once we let this installation finish, we can then import into our project the icons that we're going to need. I'm actually going to import all of the ones that we're going to use across the whole project, so you're going to see a few lines appear here. Now that we've imported our React icons, we can then use them within the project. So for the add task icon, we're going to use this TB Pencil Plus. If we copy this, we can put it within something known as a fragment. And a fragment is how you can use components within other components. Now after adding our fragment, you can see that it's not actually appearing within the add task container. If we go down to the terminal and run our application again after we've installed the React icons, you'll then be able to see the change. This is our header done. And when I say done, I mean how it looks. For now, this add task button is not really doing anything, but we're going to add this functionality later. Now let's work on our to-do list. Now our to-do list is going to be housed within another div. And this is a great point to explain how the return part of a function can only return one element. Now you might be thinking, what if I want to return the whole page? Well, that's why we have these React fragments. You'll notice if I remove these fragments, we're then going to get an error on our page. And this is because it's saying JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. This is the purpose of the fragment. The fragment is that enclosing tag. So if we add that again into the project, you'll then see that error will go away. So let's add our to-do list. Within this div is where this to-do list is going to be housed. For now, we'll just add the code for one of these items. This time I went ahead and already added the class names. So we can see we have our to-do list, which contains all of our to-do list items. For a to-do list item, we have a to-do container, we have a to-do checkbox, which is this element here. We have the text itself, which in this case is walk the dog. And then we also have our to-do delete, which is our delete button. As you can see, the font within the application is not really the one that was in the design. And this is because we haven't imported it into the project. If we go back to our index.html file, we'll be able to add this here. And we'll add this below the link. Once we save, you can see that the font has updated. This is where you'll do any font imports for your application. Anyways, back to what we were doing. Within the app.jsx, you can see that we've added our to-do list. And within our to-do list is individual to-dos. That's this code here. You can see if I copy this and paste it again, we'll have multiple to-dos. And we can keep doing this and it will fill up the page. Now this is the basic structure of our application, and it's pretty much done. We currently don't have a way of actually adding tasks, we don't have a way of checking them off, and we don't have a way of deleting them. This is where React comes in. So, first things first, having our to-do items rendered in this way is not very practical. If we were to get our to-do list from a database, for example, we would need a way of mapping that array of to-dos into generating this code for each and every single one. Let's go to the top of our file. So we need a way of storing our to-dos. And this is where we're going to use something known as a state variable. We put that state variable within our function. And the syntax for that is very simple. We declare our state variable as we do with any. We have our to-do list, which is our variable itself, and then we have a set function. So anytime we're trying to call our variable and use the value which is stored within, we would use the to-do list. If we ever want to set our variable, that's where we use this, the set to-do list. Now to manage the state of this state variable, we're going to use an inbuilt hook, which is part of React, and this is useState. For now, we're going to use this useState function, and we're going to have an empty array within it. Whatever you declare within these brackets is what is the default value for your state variable. For now, we'll have this as an empty array because we don't have any to-dos. In order to make this to-do list useful, we need a way of rendering it within our component. If we go back down to our return, we'll be able to convert this code that we have here for our to-do list into a way of mapping this array into individual components which are rendering on the page. So let's do that. First, we're going to delete all of the extra code we have for these 4 different to-do items. Once we've deleted those, you'll see we just have one rendering on our page. Now we need to make this render our real to-dos. If we just create some new lines, we'll be able to get started on this. And how exactly are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use mapping. This is the syntax for a mapping. And this basically says, for our to-do list variable, we are going to map, which basically means iterate through one by one. And we're going to take each of those elements as our list item, use an arrow function to then return what is within our return statement here. If we delete this fragment and we paste in our code that we were using to render our to-do items, we'll have our complete mapping. And just to reiterate, this is saying that for our to-do list variable, we're going to map through, and for each item, we're going to return some code. Right now you can see that nothing is returning on the page, and this is because we set our state variable to have a default value of nothing. For now we can declare a variable, which is going to be an array which is storing our to-do items. Now our variable is going to be an array of objects. Each of those objects is going to have an ID, a text, and a complete boolean, which is going to be whether or not the task has been completed. We'll default this to false, as when we add a to-do item, it's not going to be completed yet. We'll have to press the button to make it complete. Now let's use this variable. If we copy the variable name and go over to our state variable, we can replace this empty array with the name of that variable. As you can see, something is now appearing on the right, but this isn't really what we were looking for. You can see here that the text that we've got for each of these to-do items is testing 1 and testing 2. But over here, we have walk the dog for both of them. This is because we're not using the information within the object. If we go back down to our code, we'll see that we have walk the dog appearing for each of the mappings. So when we go through our array, for each of those items, we're going to return the exact same thing. We're always going to return walk the dog. So how do we make it work with the object and use the actual information? Let's delete this default text. We can then use curly brackets to break out of the JSX return. This is going to allow us to put JavaScript within our return statement, which is really, really useful, and a key point as to why React is able to build such complex application. If we take our list item and we return from that object the text that was defaulted, we'll then see that we are dynamically pulling the text for each of those to-do items. We have testing 1, and then we have testing 2. Now, although this is working, if we open up our console, we'll see that we're getting an error. We're getting this error here because we have not made sure that each item within the array has a different key. This is key for mapping. We need to add this key for each of the returns so that the browser is able to differentiate between what is rendered on the page. Although they contain different information, if the information was the same for both of them, this might cause some errors when we're trying to make changes to each of these items. Therefore, we need to add that key. We add the key here within the div, and it's simply just key equals curly brackets, and within this we're going to use our list item.id. List item is our object, and ID is the information within that object that we're trying to use. This will get rid of that error. Now for the IDs, you can see here that we've defaulted different values. This is not very practical, and in the real application we're going to have to use something to dynamically render and create new IDs on the fly. This is where we're going to import UUID, which is going to create a unique ID for each of these items. And it will do that by calling a function which generates a random string. To use the UUID library, just like we did with React icons, we're going to need to import it into the project. So again, we're going to close our terminal using Control-C if you're on Mac. And then after that, we're going to be able to do npm install UUID. After that runs, we can now use that library within our project. To use it within the project, we'll add an import in our file. After adding the import, we can use this UUID function within our components. For now, we're going to use it just within a variable. So we're going to replace the ID here with that UUID function. This will randomly generate that UUID for each of the items we have here. So we're going to copy that, and we're going to paste it in the other ID section as well. To show you how these unique IDs look, we can add a simple console log. To see these changes, we need to come back to our terminal, run npm run dev to run our application, and then we'll be able to see those changes in our browser on the right. If we refresh the page and open up the inspect, we'll be able to see that we've console logged that array into our console. After we open up the objects, you can see this ID here. This was randomly generated using that UUID library. Let's close our inspect. Now we have our to-do list working as it should. Let's first make it so that we can add an item to our to-do list. To do that, we're going to need to declare a function within the app. Now we'll do something a bit different here for adding a to-do, and we'll actually make a pop-up appear on the page. We can track the state of this pop-up by adding another state variable. Again, we have the exact same structure as the to-do list. We have our state variable here, our set function, and we're going to use state as default false, because when we load the page, we don't want the pop-up to be appearing yet. We want to change the state of the pop-up to true, and then that's when the pop-up is going to appear on the page visually. For the pop-up, we're going to add some new code. We can add this anywhere within the return, but we're going to conditionally render it. Conditional rendering is something that is really important within React applications, and it allows you to change based on state variables what is showing on the page. not only by state variables, but you can also make it change what's appearing on the page by what you imported from, let's say, a database. Let's add that code here within our fragment. Let's quickly explain what the pop-up code is that I've just added, because we added quite a bit. So we have our pop-up container, which is a div, and within that pop-up container, we then have the pop-up itself. We have some text, an input, and then we have a couple buttons, which are stored within their own container. Over here on the page, we can see that again. We have our text, we have our input, and then we have our buttons. We'll add functionality to these buttons soon. For now, let's handle how we open and close our pop-up. First things first, we don't want this pop-up to appear on the page all the time. Currently, you can see that it's overlaying on the rest of the code, and it's not really useful for our page. If we refresh, again, it's still going to be there. So let's conditionally render this component. It's pretty simple to add conditional rendering, and it's only a couple lines of text. We just need an open curly bracket, the state variable which we are using to conditionally render, and a couple and signs. So it's saying, if this is true, then render this. Currently you can see we have an error, and that's because we haven't wrapped the rest of the code in the closing curly bracket. Once we've done that wrapping, you can see that right now the pop-up is not appearing on the page. And this is because the default state for the pop-up is set to false. Here we're saying if pop-up is true, then we're going to render this code. If I put an exclamation mark in front of pop-up, you'll see that now the pop-up will appear on the screen. This is because we're now saying if it's not true, then we're going to render. Now let's add the code that's going to handle opening that container. Within our app, we're going to declare another function. This is going to be a relatively simple one. We're just going to declare the function with a name. We'll give this handle pop-up because that's what the function is going to be doing. For now, we won't pass anything into this function. Let's work on the function itself. So to change the state of the pop-up, we can use the function here. If we call that function and we set it to true, that's going to change the state of the state variable. To use this function within our app, we need to go back down to our add task code here. Within this container, we need to add an onClick function. This onClick function is going to be very simple. So we're just going to have an arrow function, which is calling our handle pop-up. If we save and then go back to our application, when we press this button, you're going to see that the pop-up is going to appear. This means that the code that we've just written works. When we're clicking this button, we're changing the state variable to equal true, which we did here within this function. So what about closing the pop-up? To do this handling, we're going to pass something as a parameter into this function, and we're going to call this action. If the action is open, then we're going to set the pop-up to true. This means we're going to open it. Otherwise, if the action is not open, then we're going to set it to false, which is going to close the container. If we go back to our button, we now need to update this onClick. Once we've changed to open, if we refresh our page and click, it's then going to open. If we had anything else written here, say ABC, then it's going to run the other part of the code. So when we press the button, it's not going to open it up. So let's give us the option to close the container. If we go to our back button, we can add another onClick function. But this time we're not going to pass open, we're going to instead pass close. In fact, we can actually pass anything in here because it's saying that if it doesn't equal open, then it's going to close the pop-up. But for now, we'll just put close because it makes sense. Now we've completed this functionality. When we go to add a task, our container is going to appear. If we decide we don't want to add a task, we can press our back button and that container is going to close. Now on to more important things. Let's add the option to add a task. Again, we'll add this function within our app. As you can see, this one is a bit more complicated. And we're using an if statement to decide what this function is doing. This function is going to use its own state variable, so we need to add that to our component. If we go back up to the top, we can declare it here. Again, we use the same structure that we used before. We have our state variable, the set function, and we give it a default. This new task text is actually what appears within the pop-up. If we open this up, we're going to make it so that anytime we make a change within this input, we're going to update this new task text. We'll add this on change later. For now, we'll just give it a default value, and we'll use that value to be able to add our task. With this default value, our function's then going to work. If the new task text does not equal an empty string, then we're going to set to-do list to the current to-do list, but we're going to do something to that. We're going to return our array of objects, which is going to contain what is currently within the to-do list, and we're going to add a new object. This object is going to be our new task. And this new task is going to have a new ID. It's going to have a default complete state as false. And then it's going to have some text, which is going to be that new task text. After we've set our to-do list, we're then going to reset our new task text back to being an empty string, and then we're going to close the pop-up. Let's make our add button actually use this function. So if we open up our pop-up, we see we have this add task button. Let's go down to that code. Here within this button, we're going to need to add another onClick function. This one's even more simple. We're just going to have onClick run this function. And this function is the add task function, which we just added. If we go to add a task and we press this add task button here, you can see that that function has worked. We've updated our to-do list and we've updated it with a new item. Currently, that new item has a default value of walk dog, which we declared here within our state variable. If we had this as walk dog 2 and we opened up our pop-up and we added the task, you'll see it's going to say walk dog 2 here. But this isn't very useful because when we're going to add our task, we're going to write something new every single time. So we need to handle the onChange for that text. In order to do that, we need to update our input a little bit. Currently, we have the class name, which is pulling the styling. We have it as type text, and we have a value. But right now, this value is nothing. Because we've declared this value as being nothing, it means that within our pop-up, we actually can't change what's in this input. If I try to type something in, it's not going to work. It's not going to update. So we need to add an onChange handler. So this onChange might look a bit complicated. If we break it down, it's quite simple. OnChange, which is triggered by an event, is going to do something. What's it going to do? It's going to call this function. And for this function, it's going to pass in a parameter. And this parameter is going to be our event target value, which is what we've written within our input. But now we have our value as an empty string. This isn't going to work. We need to make it reference our state variable. If we add curly brackets, we can then add our state variable in here, new task text. This is saying that for our input, the value of that is going to be whatever the state variable new task text is equal to. And on change, it's going to call the set new task text, which is paired with this new task text variable, and it's going to set it to the value which we've written within the input. If we go back to the application and open up the container, you can see that we can now edit what is written within this input. You can also see that it's using the new task text state variable. By this text here, it says walk dog 2, which we have set as the default value for this state variable right here. When we update this text by deleting or adding, it's then going to change. And this is changing what that state variable is equal to. This functionality now works. So if we wanted to add something new to our task list, say do the dishes, and we add our task, it's then going to add to the list of tasks. There's only 2 more pieces of functionality remaining. We need to make it so that we can confirm that we've completed a task and also allow us to delete a task from our list. Let's add those functions now. We'll create this function within the app, just like we did before. This function follows a similar sort of structure to our add task. Again, we have our function declared with a parameter that we pass in. It's important that we pass in the ID of the to-do that we're trying to change. This means that when we run our function here, we're going to know which to-do we're actually supposed to be updating. If we didn't pass the ID, the function wouldn't know which one is being updated. We'll call set to-do list to update our state variable, and we'll take our current to-do list and we'll do something to it. This is the arrow function. What we're going to do is within these curly brackets, we're going to return our current to-do list, and we're going to map through each of those items, and if the item ID matches the ID that we passed into the function, then we're going to change it. This is how we're going to make it so that we're only changing the to-do that we intended to. That's why the ID was important. And here's where we're going to use it. So when we're mapping through, if we find the item which has an ID which matches the ID that was passed into the function, then we're going to return the item as it currently is, but we're going to change the complete status to be the opposite of what it was before. So if it was false, then it's going to be true. If it's true, then we're going to change it to false. This means we can keep toggling the box to tick it off as being done, or putting it back to a need to be done status. Now that we've got our function, we can then use it within the return. If we go down to our to-do list, this checkbox is where we are supposed to be using this function. So again, we're going to add an onClick function. So just like before, the onClick function has the same structure. We have the onClick, which is then going to call the function, and we're going to pass into that function the ID of our list item. But if we go over to our application, you're going to see that this isn't quite working yet. This is because we haven't changed what's rendering based on that complete variable. If it's true, it's rendering the same thing as if it's false. So we need to add some conditional rendering to this section. We'll change this line here, and we're going to replace it with some code within a curly bracket. Like I said before, the curly bracket allows us to break away from the JSX and run some JavaScript code. Here, we're taking the list item and we're checking that variable for that object. If it's complete, then it's going to render checkbox fill. Otherwise, it's going to render checkbox blank fill. These are the two React icons that we imported into the project. This one is the checkbox with nothing in it, and this one has the tick. If we save and refresh, we'll then be able to press this box and you'll see that it adds a tick, and if we press again, it goes away. This is us completing off the task. And finally, onto our final piece of code. We need to be able to delete an item from our to-do list. This is the final function for our project, and this is the most simple one out of the previous ones that we've been doing. We'll call this function delete task. And for this, we're going to pass in the ID again, just like we did with the toggle complete, to know which one we're changing. We're going to call our set to-do list, and we're going to take our current to-do list, and we're going to return only the items within this current, where the item ID does not equal to the ID that we passed into the function. This is going to filter it out. Let's add the onClick. Again, the same structure that we've been using before. When you click, we're going to call this function and we're going to pass the ID of the object that we're trying to delete. If we go back to our application, we can test that this works. And there we go. We've deleted our tasks. We now have a complete application that works just as intended. If we refresh the page, you'll see that we'll be able to open up our pop-up and we can declare another thing to add to our to-do list. If we wanted to add a task for clean my room, we can then add this task to our list. For each of these tasks, we can then check the task off, or we can delete it. If I refresh the page, you'll see that when we try and add a task, it's still defaulting to this walkdog2 value. This is because we haven't changed the state variable to have a different default value. We still have it up here using walkdog2. So we just need to change this to be empty. Now, if we go back to the application and refresh, when we open up the container, it's going to be empty, just as intended. But you'll notice that when we refresh the page, we delete anything that we've done. If we check these two off, or maybe we delete one, when we refresh the page, it's just going to default to how it was before. This is because we're not storing our to-do list anywhere. We still have our default value, which is being used by the state variable, and we're not saving our to-do list anywhere. For this project, we're going to use LocalStorage to save the state of our to-do list, so that when we refresh the page, it still keeps what we did before. We can delete this default variable and change our state so that it's, instead of using that default value, we just have an empty array. Now when we refresh the page, you'll see that there's nothing in the to-do list. So let's make this use LocalStorage. To do this, we're going to need to change this line here. And this is going to become a little bit more complicated. Once I explain this code, it's going to make a lot more sense. We're going to use the same use state, but this time we're going to do an arrow function. Within this function, we're going to declare a variable, which is our stored list. And this stored list we're going to get from our local storage using getItem, and we're going to get the item that is called to-do list. This is what we're going to save our to-do list under within the local storage. Once we've got this variable, we're then going to return that variable. If the stored list has a value, then it's going to be passed. Otherwise, we're going to return an empty array. On the application, you can see that this still isn't working. And this isn't working because currently there's nothing stored in our local storage called to-do list. So the page is having an error. So we need a way for our application every time it loads to store something within that to-do list if there's nothing already there. So we're going to use useEffect, which is another important hook which is a part of React. We'll add the useEffect function here, and it's pretty simple. What this is saying is that every time the to-do list is updated, we're then going to go into our local storage and set an item for that to-do list by stringifying the to-do list state variable. If we were to remove the state variable from here, this would say that every time the page loads, only on the initial load, it's then going to run what's within the function. If we remove the closed brackets entirely, then it's going to say that this runs constantly, over and over again. These are the different syntaxes that you can use for useEffect. But for us, we need to use the one where you pass in a state variable that it's listening out for. So every time this changes, it's then going to run this line of code, which is going to set the item in the local storage. You'll see that the page still isn't working, and that's because I've made a typo here. And even after updating that typo, it's still not working. And why is that? Because we're trying to use useEffect without importing it into our project. We need to go back up to the import at the top, and we need to add it here. Currently we're importing just useState, and we need to add useEffect. Once we've added this, you'll see that the page is now working. Because of this useEffect function, we actually don't need to change any of the other functions. We don't need to add any code for it to use the local storage, because this useEffect is listening for any change to the to-do list, run this line of code. So when we add a task and we set our to-do list, it's going to change. So that code's going to run. Again, when we toggle the complete, same thing's going to happen. And when we delete a task, again, the same thing. So this is our completed code. This is our application. But the structure of this application is not using something known as components. Components are how React projects work, and it's the expected thing to set out your application to use components. So let's implement that into our project quickly. First up, we're going to move our pop-up code into a new file. We'll create that file within our source folder. We'll call this popup.jsx. Now within this file, we need to take that code that we had already written and add it here. We're going to import React so that we know what this file was trying to do. Within our file, we're going to add our popup function. Then we're going to make this file export this function by default. And then we need to add within our return the actual code that we're trying to return. If we go back to our app, we can get that code straight from there. If we copy all of this and remove it from the app, we can then paste it within the return here to be used. We can also remove the curly brackets because this is the only thing being returned. To determine when this pop-up is being rendered, we then need some parameters for this function, and we need to pass these parameters from our app into this function. We need our pop-up, our handler component, the ability to add the task, the text for the new task, and the ability to set that text. Within our app, we then need to pass it into this component. First, we'll need to import our file into the project, and then we need to use this within our return. To do this, we render the component within a fragment, and we pass in the things that we need. If we go back to our application, you can see that it's still working as intended, and when we press the button, we're opening our pop-up. But it's actually being rendered by pulling in that component as an import, and then rendering it within the return. I'm going to go and do the same things for all of the other components, and then I'll come back and show you what's been done. And just like that, our application is complete. I went ahead and took the header from the return and created a new file. The return here contains exactly what was in the return within the app. I did the same thing for the to-do list, and I made the to-do list render each to-do item, which is also its own component. Our app then imports all of those components, and then within the return, it uses them to render. And that's that. Our application's complete. We have our tasks here, and the ability to add them. Once we've added a task, it appears within our task list. We can complete it off, and we can also delete it. And all of this is done using a component-based structure and using all of the React hooks that we should be using. We're also storing our tasks within the local storage so that when we refresh the page, we don't lose our progress. I hope you enjoyed working on this project and can now confidently say that you know the basics of React. Thank you for watching.